I've had the pleasure to work with Dr. Ben Nobbs-Thiessen in the past, so I'm delighted to have him here with us tonight. Ben Nobbs-Thiessen was born in Vancouver. His maternal grandparents had arrived in Canada as displaced persons from Ukraine after the Second World War and settled on Fraser Street in North Vancouver. His interest in Latin American history and the Gran Chaco stems in part from, I like this part, his great uncle Gerhard Klassen, who regularly drank iced mata, yerba mata, a custom he had picked up as a little boy living in Neuland colony in the Paraguayan Chaco, where his family had settled after the Second World War, before re-migrating to join family in the Fraser Valley. Ben studied history and international relations at the University of British Columbia and returned to UBC for his MA in history. His MA thesis also had a Paraguayan connection, exploring the work of sociologist J.W. Fretz, who wrote extensively about Mennonites in the Chaco, including in his 1953 book, Pilgrims in Paraguay. Following his MA, Ben pursued a PhD in history at Emory University in Atlanta, where his interest shifted across the Chaco to Bolivia. After brief stints as a research and teaching fellow at Arizona State University and Washington State University, Ben and his family returned to Canada in 2020, where he began a new role as chair in Mennonite Studies at the University of Winnipeg. He also serves as the editor of the Journal of Mennonite Studies and, with Aileen Friesen, is a co-director of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies. His research explores the movements of Mennonites and other migrant communities across the frontiers of the Americas and has involved archival research and oral history in Bolivia, Paraguay, Mexico, Canada, and the United States. His first book, Landscape of Migration, Mobility and Environmental Change on Bolivia's Tropical Frontier since 1952, was published with University of North Carolina Press in 2020. His latest research looks at the return migration of Mennonites from Latin America to Canada. Ben, thanks for being here tonight. We look forward to hearing from you, so I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. Well, Andrea, thank you so much for that really nice introduction. And yeah, very, very pleased to be taking part in this Mennonites at War speaker series, and excited to kind of think about some of the connections and differences, of course, as we move from Russia into Canada into Latin America, to think about Mennonites engaging with societies that are preparing for war or demanding military service of their members more actively at war. Before I begin, I just want to start with a brief acknowledgement that where I live and work here in Winnipeg is Treaty 1 territory and the home of the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe, Assiniboine, Cree, Dakota, Dene peoples in the heartland of the Métis Nation. And of course, if we think about Mennonite migration to Paraguay, we have to also understand this as part of a process of settler colonialism in the region that involved Mennonites and many other groups that were welcomed into Latin American nations at the turn of the previous century. So I'm going to jump kind of into the middle of all of this as we see the Chaco War break out in mid-1932 and expand dramatically in the following few years. And I'll just start with a couple brief quotes. One description of the conflict, which immediately pulled Mennonites in, came to us by way of Roland Abercrombie, who was writing for the Chicago-based newspaper, The Christian Century. Fighting still continues in the Chaco, he wrote, and the Mennonites, a peaceful non-combatant people, seem to be the immediate cause of all the trouble. He went on to kind of lament that Mennonites had escaped. He was thinking mostly of these Russian Mennonite refugees that had settled there in 1930, escaped from from Russia to immediately kind of fall once again into harm's way. Several Mennonite colonists, writing in their own paper, Menoblatt, that they produced, beginning again in 1930, also pointed to this, what they called the sort of irony of fate, that pacifist refugees had been resettled directly into a conflict zone and perhaps provoked a war. This was sort of a recurring theme in the reporting on the conflict, which I'll jump back to a little bit later on in this talk. If we look at another report from that time, this one from Nikolai Siemens, the editor of that Mennonite newspaper, Menoblatt, he had just finished hosting a group of Paraguayan military officers at Christmas time in 1932. And after the sort of festivities, he found himself with an unexpected escort back to his village after the festivities. The officers accompanied him home, and he described himself in these words: "In the midst of armed warriors, a defenseless Mennonite." So what I want to do today is give you a bit of an overview of the Chaco War and of the Gran Chaco in general, and not presuming extensive familiarity, though of course I'll note that we're quite likely to have individuals who were born in, spent time in, or visited Paraguay in the past. And then I want to dive into, in particular, the experience of these recently arrived Russian Mennonites, who really kind of extensively narrated their experiences of the conflict, and think about how it lines up with the themes of this talk, right, about war and pacifist sort of theology. And we'll kind of conclude by thinking about the differential experiences of Mennonites in the conflict, and then of those indigenous communities that they settled alongside, who had traditionally occupied that territory. So I have a few slides I'll just pop up here. It might be, my screen sharing might not be enabled, Patrick, so maybe I can see if that'll work. But I'll just continue briefly for a second here. So the Gran Chaco, for those that aren't familiar with it, is a large lowland, relatively arid region at the interior, the heart of South America. It occupies a space of something like 250,000 square miles. So I think that makes it, according to a recent check, about roughly the same size as Manitoba, or a little bit smaller than Texas. And it kind of runs from the eastern edge of the Andes all the way out eastwards towards the Brazilian border. It connects with the Argentine border on its south side. Okay, there we go. I've got to share screen. Thanks, Patrick. And I'll just pop it up here, right? So here we have the disputed region, right? And you can see it kind of touches on 4 different nations. Argentina, not labeled, down to the south, Bolivia, Brazil to the east, and of course, Paraguay. And it's the Chaco Boreal, the central Chaco, which is listed as the disputed Chaco region in this map that you'll see here. And it's known and has been known as an incredibly challenging environment. And that's from an outsider perspective, of course, one in which we have prolonged periods of intense heat and drought. The Chaco colonies just last year had gone through a period of extensive drought in our fall, when daytime temperatures were also soaring up to 45 degrees Celsius. But it's also a region which does receive rain, and it is suitable for farming in its rainy season, a rainy season which can often turn these dusty, sort of dry trails and transport routes into choking mud. And so it remained a pretty marginal space, if we want to use that term, well into the early 20th century. The Argentine government, through violent military, what they called pacification campaigns, or the campaigns of the desert, pushed its own frontier up to the Rio Pilcomayo that you can see here, subjugating and killing indigenous groups like the Toba in the process. Brazil had sort of consolidated its own frontier, but Bolivia and Paraguay, 2 of the smaller countries in this region, had not. And they remained conflicted over the Chaco through this early 20th century period. A series of sort of diplomatic interventions did not succeed in sort of reconciling this. And the one last thing to kind of point out is that, well, you know, in the period before this 1932 to 35 war, and even in the decades after, the Chaco remained quite marginal. Again, in the imagination of both of these nations, there were plans for development that really didn't come to fruition. Since the 1980s, this has been a rapidly developing region with, we should note, some of the higher deforestation rates in the world at present, right? And a huge center of particularly ranching in the central Chaco region. So once marginal, no longer so. And I think part of my interest in studying the Chaco War is to see that the war is an early phase in that very dramatic transformation. The war itself broke out in mid-1932. Hopefully I can have a few, we can sort of see some images of the Chaco and its challenging environment here. In mid-1932, and quickly escalated. Bolivian troops and Paraguayan troops were searching for a particular lagoon, Pitiantuta, the Paraguayans called it, or Lago Chuquisaca, the Bolivians referred to it as, and the Bolivian forces overran the small Paraguayan fort that was established there. And then we had a series of much more major battles in 1932, 1933, before the Bolivian army was sort of routed from the central Chaco and pushed west. And the later part of the war is really the Bolivians fighting a sort of defensive action to hold on to the territory much closer to the Andes. It was massive in scale for Latin America at the time. It's really the largest interstate conflict of the 20th century, about 250,000 troops were mobilized. There was over 100,000 casualties. And the narrative of the war is sort of this, right? That the two poorest nations in the Americas go to war in the midst of the Great Depression over this supposedly desolate region, known as the previous slide showed as a green hell, both internally and externally, right? So this is sort of the narrative of the conflict. And then if we think about the way that it's been addressed, interestingly, despite the scale of it all, it has been relatively understudied, the Chaco War. We have a few early, very nationalistic interpretations of the conflict, and then the sort of military historians took over with detailed discussions of strategy. There are certain early works that detail the diplomatic process and the peace process that followed the war, which dragged on for several years after the end of the conflict in 1935. But it still kind of remains a relatively underexplored conflict to this day. Indeed, any book you'll read about it will usually open with those lines. We do, however, note that the Chaco War was really critical to the subsequent development of both Bolivia and Paraguay. Alfred Stroessner, the dictator that would rule Paraguay well into the 1980s, was himself a young military officer on the Paraguayan side of the Chaco War. And a similar thing unfolded in Bolivia, in which military officers and veterans of the Chaco War came home and pushed forward radical change that would lead to a mid-century revolution in Bolivia. So it's a critical moment. And then, of course, we do have the Mennonite presence in the middle, really truly in the epicenter of that conflict, as sort of a unique source base for historians. And the fact that Russian Mennonites wrote so extensively about their experiences in the war in their colony newspaper, in detailed archives which are housed in Philadelphia, means that we have kind of a unique written record of the conflict, which, aside from those accounts, we often rely on memoirs, perhaps written by military officers after the event. So it really truly is a unique angle of study to see the Mennonites as a window onto this conflict. And then I think finally, to return just briefly to the themes of the speaker series, the Mennonite presence in the Chaco, not just in the context of the Chaco War, is also revealing about this idea of Mennonites and war, since the Canadian Mennonites that had arrived there slightly earlier, from 26 to 28 really, had been driven also by the effects of war and wartime nationalism, and its linguistic implications in Canada. And of course, the Russian Mennonites that arrived in 1930 were also the product of World War I, the Russian Revolution, the Civil War, and Stalinization. So those different wartime legacies fed into this new one, as we see kind of in the coverage. And I'll return to that newspaper journalistic coverage of the conflict now. What do we make of Abercrombie's statement that Mennonites, a peaceful people, seem to be the cause of it all? Did Mennonites cause this war at the heart of South America? They're certainly central to the journalistic coverage of the conflict. We see from many different angles. Newspaper reports, for instance, from March 1932, register the strong opposition of Bolivia's diplomatic corps, who are quoted as saying Bolivia will never permit the Chaco be colonized in the name of Paraguay, and has taken the steps to see that these colonists, referring to the Mennonites, do not enter Bolivian territory. There was a bit of a compromise ultimately in which Mennonites arriving had to obtain both Bolivian and Paraguayan visas, but they were still seen as colonizing under Paraguayan authority. And then again, we have, in the lead up, in the months before the war, Bolivian newspapers like La Razón saying Mennonite colonies do not deserve to be called as such. They are ranching outposts, a tool to achieve an effective but false propaganda about an alleged work of colonization. Even the New York Times and the Globe and Mail, we can find coverage of it, but the New York Times got into the debate, writing, and this is in 1933 when the conflict's already underway. In the second year of the war, Paraguay has relied considerably upon hoe and plow as well as upon armaments, and it has used Mennonite colonization as a weapon. Paraguay hopes and believes the Mennonites will stay. This is in reporting about the fact they might have to leave the region altogether. The retention many national leaders feel would be a greater victory than ever can be won in the Chaco by arms. So you can see in that sort of reporting this idea that the Mennonites are part of this broader militarization and this Paraguayan strategy for taking control of the Chaco. It's not the only sort of smoking gun theory about the origins of the Chaco War. One of the more common ones we'll see, might have to skip a few pages here, right, is that the Chaco conflict is actually about oil. that Standard Oil, I believe, is lined up on the Bolivian side and has been developing oil reserves on the eastern edge of the Andes. And Dutch Shell are kind of prodding these two parties into this conflict to secure their own oil concessions. Ultimately, the Central Chaco doesn't have the oil reserves, which are speculated about in this reporting and in these sort of satirical cartoons. But that myth of the Chaco as a war with oil stands as sort of one other explanation for the conflict. And indeed, one Russian Mennonite whose family had left for Paraguay, but who had remained behind and was eventually imprisoned and kind of read reports in Pravda about the Chaco War while in jail, saw repeated sort of use of this discussion too, that this was Western capitalist oil companies prodding these two poor nations into battle. I think we can see ultimately the Mennonites as one aspect of the territorialization of this region. It's probably less helpful to say that they were the cause of the war. Here we can see some more reporting on this. But certainly they were part of the process of territorialization in the Chaco, and they were thus intertwined with the eventual conflict. And that process involves the construction of military forts. You can see some of them listed here, which then became major battle sites throughout the region in the 1920s. The failed diplomatic initiatives, as well as explorations that were commissioned by the Paraguayan and Bolivian governments to sort of study the region. That's where the book The Green Hell came from, and we have a similar initiative on the Paraguayan side. And as well as missions that were set up. Paraguay in particular relied upon Anglican missionaries operating often kind of out of Puerto Casado area, as well as Salesians operating closer to the Rio Putumayo, you can see here. On the Bolivian side, the Franciscans were often called in. And, in discussion of Mennonites as settlers, not as missionaries, at least initially, we see them still kind of lumped together in the minds of government officials as far as their purpose in the region. So they're certainly part of this process, which also includes extractive industries. Much of the Paraguayan claim Chaco is sold off to an Argentine wealthy businessman, Carlos Casado, who we'll know if we know a bit of the story, sells the land to the Mennonites, also builds the port that is named after him and the rail line that takes Mennonites into the Central Chaco, into this region, right between some of the major military forts, right between Toledo, Isla Poi here, and just north of Boquerón. So we can see in this arrival part of the territorialization of the Chaco. I want to turn in the rest of the talk then, though, to think a bit less about causes and about the broader structural factors and more about the experiences of Mennonites in the wartime. And we have, as I said, a wealth of materials to draw on. We can rely a little bit heavier on Mennonite reporting from Mennoblatt, their local newspaper, as well as oral histories and remembrances that were gathered by people like Peter P. Klassen after the fact. And Mennonites are certainly at the forefronts of this military strategy. As we said, Bolivian troops occupy this region right here in the early days of the war. They arrive actually briefly in the colony in Fernheim and sort of inform Mennonites that they're now under Bolivian authority. A few days later, thousands of Paraguayan soldiers arrive along this narrow gauge rail line. And we have a brief period of time in August, the month after the war breaks out, when there's a discussion that the colonies will have to be evacuated for the remainder of the war. And there's actually meetings held and then a delegation sent to Isla Poi that actually protests and requests permission to remain in the Chaco. And that is successful, that commission that goes out to the Paraguayan high command. All the while, this is being talked about and thought about among Mennonites as sort of reminiscent of the Civil War in Russia, right? We have a quote again here from that delegation. It brings memories a little distant, but still fresh in the memory of most. Interminable caravans of refugees in the Russian Civil War. Certainly the other sort of key encounter Mennonites have with armed forces at this point in time is they're using the exact same transport infrastructure. And I like to think about transport infrastructure in frontier regions and how it sort of shapes the landscape. They're using the same wagon route that connects from the colony to this narrow gauge railway, which then connects to the port. That's been their main source for taking their products over the previous years before the conflict down to Asuncion. And this is mostly all constructed by Carlos Casado for his tannin extraction company. But in the wartime context, of course, that cycle reverses itself, and now it's the main route for most of these troops to enter and be stationed in the central Chaco. So they're constantly encountering soldiers as they're trying to go purchase wheat flour or market their peanuts and their cotton in Asuncion, and they actually have to get special orders for permission to keep on using the transport system during this period of time. Again, they're successful in doing that. As far as how Mennonites experience or view the Chaco conflict as it unfolds, of course, pacifist theology is one way in which they can interpret what's going on around them. And there's a pretty nice evocative phrasing from Nikolai Siemens, the editor of Mennoblatt, in the fall of 1932. So he's seen the first part of the war unfold. And he writes, and I'll just quote here, "Storm clouds rise and rise. In place of the sought-after peace that we have searched for since the Soviet persecutions, we are surrounded by war and the cries of battle. It seems that our Chaco has become modern, with planes, cannons, munitions, enormous trucks, and platoon after platoon heading to the front as cannon fodder. What sad progress, what misery looms over our beloved patria. How unfortunate our colonies, our fields, and our children, that God send a prompt and peaceful solution to this serious conflict." And we see this repeatedly through the writings of Russian Mennonites, is sort of invoking this idea of conflict and peace and the legacy of their time in Russia. Another interesting way in which Mennonites frame their experiences and the conflict itself is through environmental comparisons and metaphors. Mennonites have lived through a brutal period of pioneering, as it were, in the early years of their settlement, in which diseases resulted in high mortality rate, as well as struggles with a very, what they perceived as a very harsh, difficult environment. They'd fought to dig wells and found the groundwater often salty. The wells had often resulted in cave-ins because of the sandy soil, which individuals had been killed in. And so they'd really experienced this traumatic early phase of settlement, sometimes having to bury their dead in improvised coffins, which they carved out of these unique Paraguayan bottle trees. And when they would later go, delegations from the colonies to visit battlefields, like those major conflicts we see here, Boquerón, and other sites of battle, they sometimes made direct comparisons, sort of saying that Paraguayans had purchased their claim to the Chaco. I think they used the phrase sort of embedded the dead in the landscape in the same way that Mennonites had through their pioneering. So there's actually kind of an interesting slippage there. Another kind of compelling connection too is the way in which Mennonites describe sometimes their farming in militaristic terms in direct context of the actual military conflict around them. And so I'm just going to have to cut over here. Yes, here we go. So in one account written by Frida Kepler about the military conflict, there's this sort of line, when will the horror finally end, describing the battle between Paraguay and Bolivia, and then an immediate transition to describing a plague of locusts that had threatened the Mennonite crops. And I'll quote again here from Klassen, who says, "The reader is well aware that swarms of locusts cause great damage to some villages in the spring. In December, we had to fight a tough battle with the migrating brood. Again and again, they tried to invade our gardens. Trenches were made in the gardens, and the courtyards, streets, and surrounding ridges in which millions of our mortal enemies found their graves." So sometimes comparisons, sometimes direct sort of metaphors linking Mennonite struggles of the landscape to Paraguayan military struggles. And certainly one of the more evocative experiences for Mennonites was witnessing thousands of troops arrive in the region and make use of the wells that they had dug over the previous years, and the extensive use of water by the Paraguayan troops as they were stationed alongside Mennonite villages. So you have this description of the buckets which are raised again and again and again, and this fear about water scarcity. Aside from the comparisons and metaphors about environment and the sort of pacifist theology, we have also direct participation in the war effort in certain ways. And one of them fits in with our notion of pacifism. Mennonites immediately in August of 1932 hold a meeting in Philadelphia and decide to engage in humanitarian aid to wounded soldiers, sort of in cooperation with the Red Cross. And we can see already just a few days later, they have loaded 9 wagons full of donations and are bringing it to Isla Poy over here, consisting of, we see sweet potatoes, beans, bread, syrup, and eggs. at Christmas in 1932, they also gathered thousands of eggs to try and bake Christmas cakes for the entire, Paraguayan contingent stationed in their region. And they find themselves, they describe, welcomed and entertained like good friends when they visit forts like Toledo and other ones in the surrounding region. Paraguayans are said to have even picked up some German to say thank you or goodbye as they visit the area. A couple years later, as we get towards the end of the war, a German Paraguayan doctor even writes an article in Mennonite sort of thanking Mennonites for their humanitarian contributions. He says that these are products of Paraguayan lands made by Mennonite hands, which reads nicely in Spanish. So we see that as one element of the participation in the war, and that fits closely with the pacifist stance. We also see direct participation in transport. So early on again, in October of 1932, the Paraguayan High Command petitions Mennonites and asks them to assist in transporting military goods, provisions, more or less, along that section of wagon track connecting the end of the railway to the forts in the interior. And there's a lively meeting in Fernheim, as well as in Menno Colony, over whether they should or should not do this. And ultimately, the decisions, I think, as historian John Eicher has also pointed out, kind of reflect the different ideologies of these two groups of Russian and Canadian Mennonites. The Russian Mennonites decide with a biblical justification about submission to governing authorities based on their own experiences in Russia and on their new set of privileges that they should support this endeavor, whereas the Canadian Mennonites reject it outright. What's compelling beyond this, though, is that in addition to sort of forced or pressured transport of military provisions, both Menno Colony and Fernheim engage in extensive marketing of their produce to Paraguayan soldiers in terms of direct sales through, say, the cooperative in Fernheim, but also a pretty lively entrepreneurial indirect spirit. And the pages of Mennoblatt are filled with individuals who really take it on themselves to try and engage in commerce. And you can imagine this is a community that's been separated by it's sometimes a weeks-long endeavor to take that wagon route and the train and the boat, the slow steamboat, down and then back up from Asuncion. Suddenly the markets are sort of at their doorsteps. And again, I won't dive too much into detail, but we could always discuss them after about this lively expression of business acumen, right? You have individuals who are trading watermelons for empty military sacks that they can use to then pack their cotton or their peanuts into for shipment down to Asuncion. They have a whole community of quite desperate soldiers who are really willing to barter almost anything. They say shoes, shirts, pants. But Mennonites are strictly forbidden from taking these, although it does appear that some of this exchange is going on. We also see sometimes exchange in terms of horses and mules that are brought in by the Paraguayan military, some that are languishing in the environment of the Chaco and are able to be purchased as well at this period of time. One of the kind of interesting anecdotal exchanges is one of the individuals engaging in this. He's looking to purchase a few mules from the Paraguayan military, and he's pulled in because he's not really supposed to be doing it for questioning. And then his friend, Mr. Folk, comes and is able to negotiate his release with a bit of a wink to his friend because he lets him know that he's actually supplying milk to the entire Paraguayan High Command. And so sometimes these are exchanges with relatively impoverished soldiers. Sometimes the exchanges are with officers as well. We have, other notable cases of a Martin Duick who loads an entire wagon full of eggs to sell to Paraguayans that are walking from the train line towards the forts. They haggle over prices, and they don't get the deal they want, so they continue on their way. I want to wrap up in the next little bit here. Again, there's a few more examples we could draw from. But I think there's what's palpable in reading sources like Mennoblatt, right, is that there are some aspects of the conflict for Mennonites that are tragic or strategic. Some of them also appear to be quite adventuresome in their engagement with the military processes that are unfolding around them. And well-known colony historian Frida Kepler, whose book is sitting back here, Mennonites in Paraguay, remembers that sort of one of his most vivid childhood experiences is this flood of soldiers into the colonies. He'd meet arriving soldiers. They'd sometimes receive gifts. His school teacher was sort of enamored of Paraguayan military songs and would start to teach them in class and give updates about the war. These were all things that other writers in Mennonite, especially Siemens, the editor, would sometimes condemn, increasing military enthusiasm of some of the children. But we do see some that took up this sort of adventuresome aspect to the wartime experience. Another individual from the colony, Dirksen, actually, when the Bolivians arrive in 1932, he's lost a prize mule, and he actually joins the Bolivian soldiers on a little excursion to try and locate the mule. While he's out there, to his horror, they actually occupy an abandoned, fortunately, Paraguayan fort, and he hastily retreats. The next day, he finds the Paraguayan military there, and again goes with them now to look for this same mule. And he's sent as a spy into this fort. The Bolivians have vacated at that point in time. So Dirksen clearly, eager to work within this potentially threatening position. The last two notes that I'll draw on here is one thing that makes the Mennonite position in the Chaco unique or potentially more manageable during the war is the presence of other foreigners. So this Dirksen, when he travels with the Paraguayans the second day, he communicates perfectly fine with the officer who is actually a Russian. And there's a whole community of Russian exiles, right, that really have been pushed by the same factors as Russian Mennonites, to places like Paraguay and other regions, Buenos Aires, that suddenly pop up in these unlikely scenarios. They're conscripted or volunteer often to serve in the Paraguayan army. And one historian notes, and actually tallied it up, there's at least 2 generals, 8 colonels, 4 lieutenant colonels, 13 majors, and 23 captains of White Russian army background that are now fighting for the Paraguayan army. And it seems there's constantly kind of a linguistic ally. In addition to that, there's a whole generation of Germans who, through the Treaty of Versailles, were sort of banned from military participation, who also fight for both Paraguay and, famously, in the case of General Hans Kuhn, for the Bolivian side of the war. And we see these people kind of intervening when Mennonites bring humanitarian aid to Toledo, the other military fort. They're met by the chief army doctor, who's a German. When they have issues with the wells in their colonies being overused by the soldiers, they have a General Ern, who's identified as a Baltic German, help them control the water supply use in the region. And when watermelons are stolen from their fields overnight by somebody, right, unbeknownst to them, the next day Ern has the troops stand there holding heavy watermelons over their heads as the Mennonites pass by. So the strange presence of these other foreigners actually is a key element to Mennonites as they negotiate this violent space. Don't conclude by saying, Mennonites, whether they're acting through aspects of pacifist theology or strategic elements or simply adventure, largely escape most of the violence of the Chaco War. A plane strafes Philadelphia in the early phase of the war. We do have counts, which I wouldn't minimize, acts of violence and sexual assault perpetrated by soldiers. But we also do note that many of these are then punished by the officer corps. So Elsa Klassen, a young girl at the time, remembers this sort of whispered discussions about soldiers did it, or mentions of these assaults. But what we really see is ultimately a Mennonite community in the Chaco whose status and security is guaranteed by both sides, Paraguayan and Bolivian. The contrast here is with indigenous communities in the central Chaco, who see their way of life disrupted and permanently transformed through the conflict. And we can see this in a few ways in Mennonite as well. In 1933, Peter Klassen writes in about the harvest. And he notes here, as in the whole colony, it is now harvest time. Beans and peanuts are being harvested. Big and small have to go into the garden. This summer, we look in vain for the lenguas or the enlet, that we would say now, the indigenous peoples that were working with Mennonites, who have always served us well in this work. Now that the war between Paraguay and Bolivia is raging, they have retreated into the bush. A few men can only be seen very rarely. For this reason, the planned missionary work among them could not be started up now either. So we see it in these labor demands of Mennonites who over their first years in the Chaco have come to depend upon indigenous labor as well. But these indigenous groups, particularly Enlet, have now been targeted by the Paraguayan military. And Mennonites can sometimes act as imperfect protectors of indigenous groups under threat. We have a report from a woman, Frida Kepler, who was a young girl at the time of 7, but she remembers a leader, Cacique Molino, who was working with her family, and the soldiers were on the way, and her mother warned him and his companions, and they were able to escape. The soldiers were furious and took her father and her brother briefly for interrogation, but then they were subsequently released. But we have another report about that same individual, Cacique Molina, who had come to purchase yams and other goods from Mennonites before his plan was to move further into the Chaco to escape the military for a period of time. And the soldiers arrived, and he was shot trying to escape at this point in time. So the ultimate experience for the Enlets, for other groups like the Toba and the Nivakle, is a process during the war of scattering and victimization, forced conscription, and disease burdens, which result in a high mortality rate and result in them kind of fleeing the space around the colonies where the war is centralized. And then as the front moves away, many return and really decide to base their lives around the Mennonite colonies in these new labor relationships and restrict their traditional sort of freedom of movement. One of the 2 individuals, members of the Enlet that write about this, Hannes Kalish and Benjamin Monroe, described this as a choice between whites that kill and whites that do not kill. The Mennonites are the latter here. So I think when we think about the missionary work that gets underway after the war, when we think about labor relations, we also have to kind of see it in the context of the war as a fundamental point of rupture for Indigenous communities and thus Indigenous Mennonite relations. So I'll end off there, and maybe we can open it up for questions, Andrea. I'll just stop my share too.
Thanks very much, Ben. And we do have some questions here from folks. So just a reminder to people, we aren't monitoring the chat for questions. So if you have a question, pop that in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. So David Shantz asks, was there resistance to the Mennonites from the Catholic Church leadership?
Yeah, just a brief response to that. Certainly, yes. Much of the early resistance to Mennonite settlement in Paraguay came from the Catholic hierarchy. Mennonites were able to negotiate with Paraguayan leaders, but there was strong opposition, and it's something that's actually cataloged by historian Bridget Chesterton, a historian of Paraguay, who's written about this in the grandchildren of Solano Lopez. So there's a chapter there if you want to read that compares how Anglicans and Salesians and Mennonites are perceived as they come in to either engage in settler agriculture or mission work. Perhaps the initial disinterest in mission work on the part of the Canadian Mennonites might have alleviated some of that concern on the part of the Catholic Church, and certainly their location, right? The vast majority of Paraguayans in its entirety nearly live in the eastern part of Paraguay and are not present in the Chaco, which is a foreign space to most Paraguayans. So there's a tolerance, I think, for all sorts of foreigners who might engage in useful activities for the state out west in the Chaco, certainly less so had they been settling in the east.
Okay. A question that I had, I was interested to hear about the economic trade that happened between Mennonites and the military during the war, and how while Fernheim and Menno Colony had different responses to assisting the military, it seems that both of those colonies engaged in that economic activity. So I'm wondering if in your research, did you come across conversations that either of those communities had of, is this good? Is it not good? And did that answer depend on whether they were willing to assist the military like Fernheim was, but Menno Colony wasn't? And it just brought to mind this quote that when we were researching the exhibit, there was a Mennonite leader in the prairies leading up to the Second World War who said, our neighbors saw in the First World War how we didn't fight, and yet we gained from the sale of our goods that in a boosted economy during the war. Our neighbors saw how we benefited, but we didn't suffer for the war. In this war, we all have to do our part. Like as conscientious objectors, we need to suffer, and we need to show our neighbors that we are participating in this with them, even if we are joining military. So that just brought to mind that very interesting kind of self-reflective comment on what do our actions look like to the people around us. And so I wondered if there was any of that kind of conversation in Mennoplot that you saw.
I didn't see too much concern that the sort of sale of colony products, especially agricultural goods, to the military was going to be an issue. Probably precisely the opposite. And there wasn't much discussion of it because it was seen as a different form of support. When military historians talk about history of the Chaco and they've kind of monopolized that discussion, they really reflect on Bolivia's kind of disastrous performance as noting that it was too far from its supply lines, right? Its army had crossed most of the Chaco from Santa Cruz way to the west, was its main supply center. And they note that the Paraguay was successful because it did have, and I don't want to overstate the Mennonite importance of selling, beans and other things like that, peanuts to the military, but it did have a supply center which was centrally located, not just because of the Mennonites, but partly because of Carlos Casado and the construction of that railway into the region. And so I think there was no concern that the official trade that was going through in the case of the cooperative would be an issue. Mm-hmm. And John Eicher, who writes a bit about the Chaco conflict at the start of his recent book, Exiled Among Nations, notes that the Menno colony immediately after the war came calling in Asuncion to that unpaid debts from the war for goods that were purchased as well be collected. So both groups did not appear to have that concern, and I think Paraguayan military officials, they don't write extensively about Mennonite presence in the conflict as being the key to their victory. The idea that there were water supplies and food supplies and other things available there figured quite positively. I'm sure it did for the long-term relationship of Alfred Stroessner as well, the subsequent dictator, and his very young experience as a military officer, who would have certainly passed through and interacted with Mennonites.
Mm-hmm. Barry Dick asks, did Mennonites face any pressure to take up arms and participate in the conflict?
No, Barry. There was the privilegium that was passed was respected in this context. I think the real linchpin was this idea about what transport of military goods constituted, and we see the differing responses from Menno Colony and Fernheim, but there was no pressure to take up arms in the conflict.
Okay. And Richard Penner asks, to what extent were the natives, the Guarani, involved in this conflict?
Yeah, and I had to rush a little bit at the end. I hope to sort of outline this a bit better about the spatial location. I wonder if it's even possible, Patrick, to just share the screen again for a second, but we can note the presence of multiple indigenous groups in the Chaco, and some, the Enlet, were living quite close to the Mennonite colonies. Okay, great. Yeah, I have it as a last slide, I think, here. Final slides. Let's see. Oops. No, that's not quite sharing the way I meant to. Okay, here we go. Oops, there we go. If we were looking at the area of the Central Chaco, you can see on this map, right, we'll note the sort of lengua mascoi territory of the Enlets. They would definitely use the term lengua at the time, was located quite close to the Mennonite colonies. And then there were a number of Guarani populations living far to the northwest. And as the Paraguayan army pushed towards the Andes, towards the western part there, and then finally there was a territorial, stalemate. They weren't able to take Villamontes, the major sort of the area that oil was actually being extracted in the southeast corner of present-day Bolivia. They retreated from that region, and a number of Guarani, many did remain and remain present in southeast Bolivia today, but some, because of the idea that they would be accused of having supported the Paraguayans, and there was a rhetoric among Paraguayans, many of who speak Guarani as a sort of second language, that these were their brothers, their indigenous brothers, as they were marching towards Bolivia. So what the result was that quite a few Guarani actually did migrate back with the retreating Paraguayan army after the territorial stalemate, when they established the new territorial lines, and some of them also did settle alongside the Mennonite colonies. So there was that movement. There was the concentration of the inlet around the colonies after the war, and other things took place too, which I didn't get a chance to mention, and that is that Argentina made use of the conflict to continue its violent policy towards the Toba on the Paraguayan Argentine border. And so under the pretext that there was a military uprising among the Toba who'd been suppressed in the late 1800s, it pushed a number of Toba across the river into Paraguay. And members of that group also came to settle around the Mennonite colonies along with the Nivacte. So we had a kind of a complete spatial reorganization of indigenous groups in the Chaco. It's unfortunate that it doesn't have an English version as far as I know, but there's a great edited collection edited by Nicholas Richard called Malaguerra, Terrible War, and it's about the history of indigenous groups in the Chaco War.
Thanks for that. We have a couple comments about the idea that Mennonites perhaps provoked the Chaco War. So Peter Harms, not really a question, but says, ironically, the Mennonites as non-resistors are partially the reason for the Chaco conflict. And then Blake Ham says, how much did the Mennonites provoke already existing tensions that they were migrating into?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, from the perspective of Mennonite studies, it's important for us to think critically about the way that Mennonites may have been implicated in increased hostilities in the central Chaco. We also run the risk sometimes in our own little sort of rabbit hole of giving too much credit, right, to our actors, as we think critically. And so certainly the Chaco conflict, and maybe if I can still share, I'll pull up another slide. I didn't really run through most of my slides as I was talking, is really, Blake, about the long process of territorial reorganization from the failure to draw clear lines or the conflict over sort of arbitrary lines created by the collapse of Spanish Empire. And so it's a pretty old story. Some of what's going on between Paraguay and Bolivia are debates about the viceroyalty of La Plata, which is created late in the period of the Spanish Empire and gives sort of authority from Buenos Aires, which was a marginal port originally, authority over a huge swath of territory, including much of the Chaco. And so Paraguayans are kind of claiming, no, we inherited this as the process of our independence, whereas Bolivians are claiming a much older legacy when the viceroyalty was based in the present-day Lima, but extended all the way down into the Chaco. And so, after the war, and I'll just pop this up briefly, but let's see, off we go. So we've got a couple slides here, but after the war, we can kind of see these nations, before the war, we can see these nations sort of sorting out their territorial boundaries. And the sad story from a nationalist perspective in Bolivia and Paraguay is this idea that they're carved up by neighboring more powerful nations in the 19th and early 20th century. And so Paraguay engages in a disastrous war, the War of the Triple Alliance, in which it simultaneously declares war on Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil in the 1860s and loses something, according to estimates, like 80% of its adult male population and about 60% of its entire population in this conflict, which drags on for years, even though it's expected that Paraguay will be immediately defeated. And you can see the regions of Argentina and Uruguay and Brazil that are claimed as a result of that conflict. And that's one of the reasons that it's refusing to let go of the western part of the country of the Chaco. It seems that this is it cannot accept any more territorial losses. And then Bolivia with an equally disastrous post-independence record in which it loses sections of territory to Chile in the War of the Pacific. This is nitrate-rich coastal desert region here. It loses territory to Peru and also to Brazil during the rubber boom. So a lot of commodity interests are carving up the country for neighboring nations as well. And losing its seacoast here, it becomes obsessed with finding an exit to the ocean. And so its goal in claiming sovereignty over this region of the Chaco is that it can access the Paraguay River and thus gain access to the Rio de la Plata river system, which will take it out to the sea by Buenos Aires. So these territorial realities with long roots are really what drive the conflict forward. And this just gives you an example of some of the different lines that diplomatic intervention fails to secure a peaceful alternative to the conflict. But that said, Mennonites do arrive, at a point, right? It's 1928, essentially, by the time Mennonites are really settling from Canada. And that is a moment when we almost see war declared between Bolivia and Paraguay. It's narrowly averted. We have to think about that settlement as part of that. And the same thing with the war that breaks out just, a year and a bit after Russian Mennonites arrive.
And we have a question here from Robert Martins. He says, Mennonites were part of the colonial package, and the indigenous were once again relegated to the background. Was there anything in the Mennoblat that indicated a Mennonite indigenous relationship, or were they essentially two solitudes?
That's a really interesting question, Robert. And I think that, when I highlighted that article that noted that the Enlit had sort of fled briefly, the lengua as they're referred to, as the army came in, we saw the disastrous consequences for those that didn't flee. It's pretty quiet in the first years of Mennoblat. So from, 1930 up until, near the end of the war, as far as indigenous Mennonite relations, we know they're clearly from the earliest days, there's labor relations that are immediately developing. The Enlit are also manufacturing rope, which the Mennonites are purchasing and acting as guides. Occasionally you get little accounts of like a lost boy who wandered out of one of the villages, and inevitably it appears that it's the Enlit that helped locate them. So they're there, but there is this sort of silence about the implications of this evolving relationship. And then by the end of the war, it sort of erupts into this profusion of discourse about indigenous Mennonite relations. And Mennonites actually petition the Paraguayan government at the end of the war for the right to begin doing missionary work. They've laid these plans early on before the conflict, but they haven't done anything. And and they say in quite dramatic, I think disturbing language in a way that their goal is to bind the Enlit to the land, right? And they mean that by instructing them in how to be settled farmers, right? And this is a semi-nomadic group which practiced some farming, other forms of subsistence over time. And that's welcomed by the Paraguayan state because that fits in with their model of frontier development. So the missionary work begins immediately after the end of the war, and it expands to include other groups which have also settled alongside the Mennonites, but it's primarily targeted initially at the Enlit. So certainly not two solitudes. Right away, labor relations and sort of living alongside one another, and then a more deliberate form of evangelization, which again, and I think if we want to get notable contrasts on the board here, right, just as Menno Colony kind of refused to transport military provisions, they also have much less interest in any sort of evangelical work, although they do this eventually, but it's several decades later when that gets underway. I'd have to check the date, but I believe primarily in the 1950s. I'd spoken to one individual who was kind of part of that when I was visiting years ago.
Great. I don't see any more questions. So Ben, thanks so much for broadening our conversation to incorporate this perspective from Mennonites in Paraguay during this time. Something we haven't been able to touch on in the speaker series so far, and something that we weren't able to touch on in the exhibit itself. And so we need to have this opportunity to broaden the conversation beyond the borders of North America and Europe. So it's also really exciting to see how many people have tuned in tonight. And so on behalf of MHV and on behalf of the people who are tonight, thank you so much for being here with us and sharing your research with us.